If you're wondering about the sudden lack of content, it's because I've been suffering from a rare condition called brain fart. Well, I'm back and I did a little bit of research while away, and I've got a couple of projects that I think you're going to want to see. So let's get right to it. Let's go. Grab yourself a stick of 1x6 and some 1x4. And for our first project, you'll need approximately around 32 inches of a 1x6 and about 4 foot of a 1x4. I'll start by marking a 45-degree miter on the corner of my 1x6, pulling over to 16 3/4, making that the long point of a separate 45-degree miter. Over here at the miter saw, I'll turn that miter to 45 degrees. And I'll go ahead and get my first piece cut. Now, using that same 45-degree miter on the offcut, I'll line up one of my miters with that last miter and then make a second piece. Now for our 1x4, I'll get this ripped directly in half, and that'll leave us right around 1 3/4 inches for both pieces. I'm going to eyeball for the length that I want my slats to be, and that worked out to be right at 8.5 inches. So I need to get 11 of these cut to that 8.5 inch, so I'll use a stop block and set that up for consistent cuts. There's 42% of my viewers that have yet to subscribe to the channel. If that's one of y'all, be sure that you head down below, smack that like button, but also hit subscribe. It's absolutely free. Now gather all your pieces, and we'll add a dab of glue, 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 add a dab of glue. And we're gonna pop a Brad in his ass. I'll start by nailing both the bottom and the top pieces on both sides. Once I get those two pieces nailed on each side, I'll do the filling in process, and my gap is gonna be right at 1/4 inch. I'm just eyeballing for my piece. However, if you wanted to, you could cut a 1/4 inch spacer, and that will help you get consistent spacing. Once I get all the slats nailed on my two sides, I'll butt the bottom left and right up against the two slats, and then I'll just fill in my middle piece. Now, I could leave this piece just like this and have it act as a poopy stoop or a kid's step stool, but we're not going to do that for this project. We're actually going to be making this into a basket. So what I need to do is grab another piece of 1x4, and I'm going to get that piece of 1x4 cut to 12 inches. And I'll be getting it ripped directly in half at 1 3/4 inches. On those two 12-inch pieces, what you're going to want to do is pull down from the top at 3/4 inch and mark the center of the width, right at that 3/4 inch mark, and get those intersecting points punched. And with the 5/8 inch Forstner bit, I'll be drilling out at those punch marks all the way through. Now I want to add a round over to my top, right here where my hole is. So I'll come down from the very top at about 1/4 inch. And I'm using a 2-inch round cylinder, which is basically my little mallet. That way I can get the shape that I want. And I can refine this shape over at my belt sander. Some 80 grit sandpaper on my belt sander makes quick work of these roundovers. However, if you don't have a belt sander, just use a jigsaw. And ultimately, I'll get everything sanded down to 150 grit. I'll make a light little mark right where my handle meets the top here. That way I know where to stop my glue. We'll add a dab of glue. And basically what you want to do is line up your handle with the center piece at the bottom. And I'll use my speed square just to make sure that I'm nice and square. Make sure you're flush with the bottom and lined up with your center. And Papa Brad in his ass. And we'll do our opposite side. Now measure the distance from outside to outside down here at your base. And I've got 9 7/8. I've got some 5/8 inch dowel that I'm going to be using for this. So I'll pull down to 9 7/8, make a mark, and get this cut. Now, burn it, stain it, paint it, add a little bit of hay to it, put your gifts inside, and you've got yourself the perfect Christmas gift basket. After doing some research online, these things range from a price range of $35 upwards of $50 per basket. Now, if you were to personalize it with some laser engraving options and add the gifts with the basket sale, you could get more bang for your buck. Now for our next project, you're going to want to get your hands on some of this Douglas fir 4x4. Or you can get some hardwood, but make sure it's at least 2.5 inches in thickness by 3 inches wide. I'll pull over to 12 inches and get a piece cut over at my miter box. I want to get rid of any kind of round over on these edges, so I'll take care of that over here at my jointer. However, if you don't have a jointer, just take it back to your table saw and it'll work just fine. I'll flatten out 2 sides of this piece. That way I get it nice and square and don't mess my whole piece up. Now I'll get everything milled to the dimensions I want it. I'll be milling it down to 2.5 inches by 3 inches. Next, I'll get the bevel of my table saw set to 25 degrees. And on our 3¼ inch width, I'm going to be cutting 2 bevels at the very bottom, coming in at 1/2 inch. Let me demonstrate. I pulled in at 1/2 inch and made a mark. So I'll line up the kerf of my blade with those marks I made and run this through. Now I've got my bevel of my miter saw set to 25 degrees as well, and I'll line up the kerf of my blade with that first bevel I made, making that cut, assuring that they both line up. I'll make that cut on both ends. now that I got those two ends cut, what I'm going to do next is line up the kerf of my blade with that mark again, keeping my saw on 25 degrees. And I want the bottom of my cut to be lined up with that bevel. So I'll make these two cuts on both ends. Now from that short point, I'll pull over to 4 inches from the right side. And from the left side, I'll pull in at 3 1/4. So we'll start with our 4-inch mark, and that's going to be the short point of our 25-degree bevel, cutting it this direction. Just like so. Now I'll flip my piece, and this 3 1/4 inch mark is going to be the long point coming back the other direction. Just like so. Next, I'll mark out the centers on each 3 of these pieces at the top. And we'll punch. And we'll punch those intersecting points. Now, some of you may be concerned with this smaller piece having a tilt issue, but it's actually just right to where it won't tilt over on you, obviously unless you press it down. But as long as you set it right like that, it won't tip over on its own or if you bump into anything. Sorry about that. I'll bring each 3 of those pieces over to the vise and install an 1.5" Forstner bit in my drill, and I'm going to be drilling down to a depth of 5/8 of an inch for each piece. After I get those holes drilled, I'll get everything sanded down to 220 grit. I'm going to use some of this honey stain to finish my pieces off. I'll be applying 2 coats of this oil-based stain, making sure that I wipe down between each coat. Out of that one 4x4x8, you can get 8 of these built. These go online anywhere from 35 upwards of 50 bucks. Do a little bit of math, you're looking at a few $100s out of that one 4x4x8. And all you got to do is add a couple of bevels to it and give it a little bit of shape. And you've got yourself a bestseller.